It's Wednesday, April 24th, 2024, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behavior comes to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my School of Journalism colleagues, Kiely and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, is it the end of the question about bias at NPR? The editor who wrote that essay critical of the network has resigned. We're going to talk about what's been going on the last few weeks. We'll also remember journalist Terry Anderson, an Associated Press reporter who became a household name, kidnapped and held hostage in Lebanon back in the 1980s. And another movie about journalists. We'll talk about the portrayal of the photojournalists in the film Civil War. There's a lot more that we will get to today, hopefully before our half hour is up, but we're going to start with the opening statements and the initial witnesses in the trial against Donald Trump. Now, how terrible is it that I read about what's going on in that courtroom every day, and I wish so badly, we spent so much time last week talking about the O.J. Simpson trial and the trial of the century, that I almost wish we had the cameras in the courtroom for that same level of wall-to-wall coverage, even to see the most mundane, but to really be in that room when it's happening.
Yeah, I think it would be good for America, actually. I think it would be good for everybody to be able to watch reruns, to see these things, because Trump himself is saying he's being unfairly treated in the courtroom. This way, Americans could decide for themselves. And I think watching the witnesses be cross-examined, I think there's nothing like show and tell, right? So I'm for cameras in the courtroom, and I recognize, because I was the one who talked about the giant circus atmosphere last week at the OJ trial. But I think the other side of that is, especially now, in a time when people are so mistrustful of institutions, watching how the institution works or doesn't work would be very helpful, and particularly in this case.
I agree with everything you said, but I don't know whether or not we as a society would actually sit and watch that. I just don't know. I mean, because the way in which we engage with the media now is it's so clickbaity, I guess, for lack of a better word. I mean, can you hold their attention for that long? Yeah. I mean, because as you know, being a court reporter, and I just know when I was covering the courts, there is a lot of mundane sort of things that happen.
There's a reason people fall asleep.
Yes, absolutely, and yes, true. I'm sure he wasn't the only one that fell asleep, but I mean, to me, I just don't know if there's enough drama there to keep the audience engaged.
Yeah, well, we put Congress on when they're in, and it doesn't, it's a select audience, clearly. And but I agree with you. You're right. This struck me when the January 6th hearings were televised, because I kept thinking how different that was from Watergate. Yeah. Watergate had the whole nation spellbound, even though it was a boring congressional hearing. But this January 6th hearings were produced. They were produced for TV because I think exactly what you said, the organizers felt they couldn't hold people's attention otherwise. So what does that say about us?
Yeah, absolutely.
How might the coverage be different of what we're seeing right now? We're still seeing a lot of hyperbolic language, a lot of the responses in coverage that comes out during the day in the dribs and drabs or into the evening. How might that look different if we were able to be that fly on the wall, if we weren't relying on a reporter to distill all that information down?
I don't know how different it would look. Okay. And I don't even know if we as an entity, the news media, are even capable of doing that, because we've sort of looked at the entire Trump era, shall we say, which we kind of are still in. We've looked at that as one ongoing series of dramatic episodes. And how would we be able to then all of a sudden say, okay, well, we're going to go back to actually covering it with some context and with trying to provide news and information that will help the audience to understand? Because we haven't done a whole lot of that when it comes to Trump because of what he and his people have done. I mean, they have turned it into, going back to what you were saying, they have turned it into these sort of dramatic episodes that can then be captured.
So really, we're just now into episode whatever number of season 9, and this is just how the drama has unfolded.
Yeah, I think that the news coverage would be pretty much the same, only because I think they serve two different purposes, right? There are going to be some people who would want to tune in and watch the thing in toto or in big chunks, or they would use it for verification of the news coverage. But the news coverage is there, and you're probably like me, and you're probably like me, that I don't watch press conferences,
right?
Even when they're televised. I wait for some poor schlub who used to be me, who has to sit through the whole thing and boil it down to the most interesting bits. And so I prefer to consume my news like that. But I do think in this case, for people who want to watch it, it would be great to have that option. The other thing I just want to say about the current news coverage, yesterday was not a great day in the courtroom for Donald Trump. But if you looked at the websites of the New York Post and Fox News, you would have no idea.
Yeah.
And that's the part that really makes me wish that those cameras were there, and that this was, not to say that it's not a fully transparent process, because anybody who wants to could go in, but it would make it even more so transparent and accessible.
Well, I think harder to avoid for people who, it just, you have to look at these things, and it would be harder to escape.
Yeah, no, I agree with you in that instance, but I guess I keep going back to something that you just said, which is people want to, even those of us, we want to have that sort of digested for us, and some would want it digested in a traditional journalistic way, where these are the most important points that were made by all parties involved, and then you have some who said, nope, I just want what's going to confirm what I agree with, and they're able to get all that, both for good and for not so good. So I just it is the news media ecosystem that we live in, but it's also the news media ecosystem that we've supported,
that we built ourselves.
We built ourselves, yeah, absolutely.
Well, so the journalism world lost two important figures in the past week. Robert McNeil died at the age of 93, and Terry Anderson passed this weekend at the age of 76. Terry Anderson was a household name in the 1980s. I remember him visiting my elementary school for an assembly following his release from captivity. You'll remember the Associated Press journalist was working in Lebanon when he was snatched from a war-torn street in 1985, and he was held captive there for 7 years. And Kathy, it was strangely ironic that, I don't know, what was it, about 10 days ago, you and I were talking about something completely different, and you had brought up Terry Anderson's name, that back in 2002, he was a guest on Global Journalist, which was a program we had produced here, a guest of our late faculty member, Stuart Laurie.
Yeah, well, and we have that audio. It's available on MoSpace, and because we're digitizing those broadcasts, and that's how I was aware of it.
Yeah.
But Terry Anderson, the business, and I use that word advisedly, business of kidnapping journalists really started with him. And I think we see, sadly, situations like Evan Gershkovich, whose sentence or his time in prison, his appeal was just denied, so that effectively extends his time in a Moscow prison. the terrible story of Austin Tice, and who has been
Also
held,
still in captivity.
still in captivity after more than 10 years. So, but I think what has happened, and it was interesting in the interview with Stuart Lurie, Terry talks about this, because that particular interview happened right after the murder of Daniel Pearl, another American journalist who was held hostage and then murdered. And what Terry's talked about was how early in his career, journalists could go anywhere, and people would view you as a neutral party. Now they view you as some kind of a bargaining chip, and I think the real losers in that are the average people whose stories aren't going to get told, because the journalists can't go there for fear of not only being the misery of captivity, but then think about what you put your own government through, your own family through, and you really have to think about that. Is that a responsible thing to do when then you can become a bargaining chip for, in the case of Evan Gershkovich, we know that Putin wants to trade him for a stone cold killer who's in prison in West Germany. So it's an awful situation, I think, for journalists and editors who have to make decisions about where to send journalists. It's a really, really tough thing, and it started.
I
with
think
Terry.
the last point you said is what's bad for both the journalists as well as for the world, is that we don't get that news and information because the journalists and the news organizations that support them are basically saying we just can't, for safety reasons, we can't send people there. We can't even hire freelancers who live there who are part of the community, because once they're exposed as journalists working in that kind of environment, that puts them at risk and their families who are still living there as well. So, I mean, that to me, one of the differences between what was happening in the 80s and 90s and what's happening now is that, we sent journalists there. Terry Anderson was an American who was the bureau chief in Lebanon and had been in various parts of the Middle East, but he was basically hired and sent there by the Associated Press. Then we flipped the script and we said, no, we're going to hire people who actually live and understand these cultures, but also understand how to cover these events in ways that will really open up the story to a much larger audience. Now they find themselves in that situation. So we don't even have a model anymore by which we can even have journalists in those particular instances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Jason Rezaian, who was another Iranian American journalist held hostage, he talks about dark zones around the world and how they're growing because of exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about. It's thuggery ruling the world.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Well, it's a sad legacy, and I also think about how we've also used safety in some ways to also justify the shutting down of bureaus for economic reasons as well, and where and how we're losing some of that coverage.
Well, the one thing I will say on a higher note about a more hopeful one about Terry Anderson came back and taught journalism.
Yep.
Yeah.
He believed in journalism, and so I think that that I think should be the real legacy here, that despite what happened to him, he was training people to go out there and tell stories. Right. And that's important because it promotes understanding of each other.
Yeah. So last week and the week before that, I was going to ask you both about what has been going on at NPR. We kept running out of time both weeks. So I have a chance to bring it back today because there's been a new detail this week. And my questions haven't really changed all that much. The unrest at NPR after Early Berliner's piece in Barry Weiss's publication, Free the People. In in this essay, he had written that NPR had lost its way, moving way too far to the left during the Trump administration. We were talking, Ernest, about some of this ecosystem we had built ourselves. And in the essay, cited NPR's coverage during the Russian collusion investigation, its ignoring of Hunter Biden's laptop, and leaning very heavily into debunking the lab leak theory is the cause of COVID. He said that the network has taken to covering the news with a rigidly progressive mindset. And now, after having served a 5-day suspension, he has resigned from the network. Now, Ernest, at the very beginning of this, we had been wondering how it was he was even still working there. Because before we even get into that idea of criticizing the employer in public, he actually went and got published in another publication outside of that of his employer.
Right, and that's the rationale that NPR used to suspend him.
Right.
Was that, look, it clearly states in our policy that if you go and do this, you have to ask for permission before you do that. Whether you which
is customary.
And many of the NPR personalities and reporters and journalists do that all the time. But they've sought permission and basically said, hey, if you want to do that, that's fine, or no, this is not going to work. He chose not to do that, and that's why they suspended him. And so, to me, all the other things that he talks about, as legitimate as they are, doesn't preclude the organization from following its policy.
Yeah, the interesting thought experiment is, what if he had gone and asked for permission and said, oh, here's the essay I'm planning on running? What would have happened?
Well, here's what I think would have happened. I think what would have happened is exactly what happened when he ran it. They basically said, wait a minute, if you're going to say all these things, where's your evidence to back it up? Because basically what NPR did after he published this was to went back and said, okay, you're making these specific charges about specific stories that we've covered. Here's the actual evidence. Mm-hmm. I mean, David Flokinslick and others basically went and said, no, we actually did do this, or no, we actually had Adam Schiff on this many times, not as many times as you claim that we did. No, in the Russiagate investigation, we did these things, and so they actually went out and challenged him with facts on some of the claims that he made.
Well, and maybe that's one of the big wins out of this, is that even if he did go out there and maybe inappropriately put this in another publication, he did put NPR in a position of going back and holding itself accountable, doing that inventory to be like, okay, maybe we're not doing some of the things we've been accused of here.
Or maybe we are.
We are.
And here's the thing. I think that...
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The fact that accountability and that inventory happened is not a bad thing.
Those kind of arguments are the kind of arguments we should have every single day in newsrooms. They should be just out there in the open, because if we don't, we're not doing our job. And I do think there's a real danger, and I've been saying this for years to my colleagues, that Donald Trump waves a red flag at journalists, and he's just hoping you run at it. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we have to be really, really careful to respond in a way that's professional and measured. And it's not very satisfying, actually.
It's hard to be the bigger person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be the professional when you're being baited. So I think that kind of an examination of conscience is good. I think it's unfortunate that it had to happen the way it did. It would have been much better if it had been inside the newsroom. I don't know if he tried to do it inside the newsroom first.
Well, I mean, I think that he claimed that he did. However, one of the things that I will say is that NPR said, even prior to Black Lives Matter, even prior to Donald Trump coming on the scene, that it wanted to grow its audience and it wanted to reach a more diverse audience. And it started to do programs that have guests and have speakers and have sources that created a more diverse environment. That was one of the things he talked about in his article. But NPR was pretty open about what it was doing, and I think part of his argument was that it had gone too far for him in terms of where they were going. But NPR has been pretty open about what they were doing.
So our next topic comes to us from Lawrence, Kansas, where 4 high school seniors led the charge against the Lawrence Public Schools and their use of spyware, the school district's use of spyware, and they won. Kathy, these students described themselves as being unapologetically loud and fighting back against the use of AI software to screen for what?
Yeah, well, the purported use of this software was going to be to screen for students who are showing signs of a possible psychotic break, some kind of danger to themselves or to others. The students were journalists who were concerned that this would be a handy way, because it's a tool that goes through all of the Google files of the school and trying to flag the language using, I guess, natural language analysis to try to flag for certain terms. What a handy way to find out what the student journalists are working on. And so that was their concern. But I think they really, in raising that concern, they raised a much larger issue about privacy in the public sphere. And to me, this is another one of those tools. It's very creepy, that your stuff could be online because you work at a place or attend a school, and suddenly some bot is rifling through your cyber drawers and finding out what you've got in there. And I think,
and by that she means the drawers in the dresser. Yes. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. I'm keeping it PG.
Well, who knows?
Okay, well, keeping it PG as we're talking about student privacy and going through drawers. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
But then the question is, if there's something that, you would think, even I've been concerned about this with some of the AI uses, even in higher education. Yeah. If you're a researcher and you're working on a paper that's original, that, is an idea that's yours alone, and your company is using one of the AI tools, are they going through all of that language
and who has access
putting
to
it out there into some large language model that could be? So I think there are a lot of new concerns about privacy that all of this technology raises. And I think these students were on the cutting edge. Good for them. Yeah. They won.
And the whole thing is, too, and how they won, that kind of impressed me. Like, the school district thought they were doing something really good to protect students, to try to anticipate perhaps mental health crises or something else, and hadn't really considered the full impact of what they were trying to do there.
Well, my issue with it is that they didn't vet the process or what they planned to do with the people they were supposedly helping.
Right.
That's the thing that bothered me. But one of the things that bothered me about this was, like, you didn't talk to the students. You didn't really even talk to their parents. You just all of a sudden made a decision.
Well, and when are we going to learn that there's not an app for everything?
Right.
Really, I mean, how about just paying attention to the students and looking them in the eye and seeing if they look troubled?
Especially because I'd have to wonder, too, as you say that, and about some of our other uses of AI as we experiment, how many false positives there could have been there
100%.
too, and the undue harm that might be, like, for all of the horrible things it might stop, the undue harm that could result from a false positive too. Before we go, there's a new movie playing across the country. It's called Civil War. It's a dystopian film starring Kirsten Dunst and Nick Offerman that follows a team of journalists traveling across the U.S. during a rapidly escalating second Civil War.
We're moving to D.C. today.
We need to go down there.
They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol. Every instinct in me says this is death. What?
Every time I survived a war zone, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this. But here we are.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. What? Well, you're American, okay? Okay. What kind of American are you? You don't know?
So at the end there, you heard Jesse Plemons asking the people who they were saying that they're Americans, those were photojournalists. And mind you, I haven't seen this film yet, but I've heard descriptions. And one of the other key scenes in the film comes when the character, Jessie, that's a young woman who is a novice photojournalist, building her skills and learning to distance herself from the violence that she's covering. She asks her mentor, Kirsten Dunst, if she would photograph Jessie being killed. The mentor says she just might. Like, if she were to come upon and witness somebody killing her, she would shoot that photograph. And later on, there's a scene that I'm not going to spoil. Someone spoiled it for me. But I am going to ask you this. Why is it Hollywood can't ever get that portrayal of journalists right? Because I can't ever imagine a situation where either one of the three of us would be out and document our own murders.
Well,
unless I'm,
I think part of it. I think part of the reason why they can't get it right is that they have a hard time. Number one, they don't really understand what a journalist does, and even more so than that, they don't see journalists as in a basic humanity. It's like, we're human too, and under certain circumstances, we're going to do things the way any other human would do it. It's not like you become a journalist and you all of a sudden stop being human. And that's the thing. I think that
and if you do, you're doing it wrong.
If you do, you're doing it wrong.
Well, and I'm going to be the I'm not going to say the word, but I'm going to speak up for that. We document things in journalism.
Yes.
And sometimes they are hard things. And the story that I think of that's recent is, I believe it was Lindsay Adaro, the great New York Times photographer, who was on a bridge where the Russians had promised the Ukrainians safe passage and instead just started lobbing missiles. And she saw people getting killed and could have been killed herself, but went across the bridge and took pictures of the dead bodies. Why? Because she said afterwards, this is a war crime and I must have the evidence. That is part of our job.
I agree with that, but I mean, I'm thinking about it in terms of what you're saying.
These are two colleagues.
These are two colleagues.
These are not people from which there is this distance.
Yes, I think that's the key, because
this is the three of us being in that setting, and do I shoot a photo of one of you being
right? I mean,
I've been,
attacked,
or do I come help you?
Yeah, I've been in situations with photographers where they put themselves in danger, and I'm the one trying to help the photographer get out of danger. Because, I mean, photojournalists are a different breed. I mean, they really are, and I love them to death.
Yes,
but they will do exactly what you just said, and usually, at least in my instance, and I've talked to other reporters about this, they're the ones going in, grabbing the photographer, saying, "Okay, you're a little too close,"
right,
and pulling them out. But that's not. But I think if it's someone that photographer is close to, like in what you described, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, I think the idea that people have let their adrenaline override their ethics.
Yes.
That seems to be the stereotype of journalists.
Well, and Hollywood keeps bringing that back again and again and again, along with a lot of other tropes. I think about, I really think about everybody who used to tell me they loved watching The Newsroom, the Aaron Sorkin show. And the only people I ever knew who liked The Newsroom were people who had never been in one.
Right.
Because for the rest of us, it was like, there's nothing about this that's real. Yeah. So... we are just about out of time for this week. I would like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics that we talked about today. You can do that by going to our links blog. It's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle there is @views on KBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, see what we might be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Takia Thomas for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our theme music, and Nate Brown is our social media manager. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again when we're back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.